Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this RM EduSummit session on impactful assessment tracking. In this session, we'll be hearing from Martin Hall and Kim Marchak about how you can utilise your school management information system to better track, analyse and gain insights from your assessment data. Just a couple of things to note before I hand over to Martin and Kim. One, if you've got any questions for the presenters during the presentation, you should see a little chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you want to leave your questions in the Q&A section there, then we'll pick those up at the end and ask them to Martin or Kim. Also, while they're presenting, if you do need to see the presentation in full screen at any point, if you just hover over the presenter's view, you'll see a little expand to full screen icon. So that'll be useful when you're seeing the demo. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Martin and Kim.
Thank you very much, Mel. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. So we're going to be talking about impactful assessment and tracking. And Kim, could you move to the first slide, please? So assessment data is used in many different ways in schools, from the classroom teacher to subject leaders to the SLT to the local authority, trust leaders and governors. And the amount of data that has been used and stored is subject to much debate over the years, ranging from the collation of national data into things like league tables, benchmarking of data between schools, and the debate around how much data do we store and actually share within the school. Fundamentally, I think there has to be a value in the data stored. Is the effort used to collect the data worth it versus the outcome achieved from the data? Sort of like a cost-benefit analysis. After all, if you didn't put the effort into collecting and storing that set of data, what else could you be doing to improve the pupils' learning? I think that schools want to maximize pupils' progress and understanding using the appropriate amount of effort. By appropriate, I mean the right amount of effort. I mean, who wants to spend hours filling out a data capture form that in the end are just not used or are ineffective? There are fundamentally sort of two types of assessment data that are collected. So you've got summative and formative. So one can be described as the assessment of learning and one is assessment for learning. Now, I would argue that a good management information system should be capable of storing both types of assessment and have the ability to summarize this to the viewer in a way that allows them to understand the data and take action where needed. The data stored should also be seen from the macro as well as the micro view for the audience it's designed for. So for instance, as a governor, the data should help me make decisions about how the school uses its resources or needs more. Whereas as a teacher, I might want detailed information at a child level to help inform my teaching. If we just move to the next slide, there's a little sort of summary from the Ofsted manual. So Ofsted have recognised that data can have value as long as it's used appropriately. Schools and teachers have the ability to set their own parameters around data, what to collect and what to share. I think the key phrase here is that Ofsted are interested in the conclusions drawn and actions taken from internal assessment information. And this is the key. What data do you collect and how is it used? Is that effective? In this session, we will explore how RM Integris and the companion Hello Data can help schools to configure their assessment systems to meet their needs, and how data can be effectively used in a school. We will also touch on how data can be used at a school and a trust level. So I'm now going to hand over to Kim to take you through the next part of the session.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so I'm going to sort of expand on some of the bits that Martin has spoken about, and I'm going to begin by exploring this autonomy side of things. And the autonomy, what I mean by that really is the choice of what is recorded and how it's recorded is now entirely up to each individual school. And this came in when the new curriculum came in, and I think some schools have actively embraced this, whilst others, and probably the majority of schools, are still very nervous and quite anxious about this idea that it's entirely up to each school to choose the methodology that they want to use. And I think what we saw in the early days is a lot of people reinventing levels, which, to a certain degree, I did the same in my job as helping people, schools develop tracking systems. That's what ended up happening. Is people wanted something that just wasn't called a 4B; it was just called Emerging, Developing, Secure, or something similar to that. But I think some of this anxiety has come about because I think fundamentally schools don't necessarily trust that when Ofsted land, that they are not going to come in and say, well, show me all your data, show me everything you've got. And I think it's taken time for schools to realise that actually that isn't going to happen now and doesn't happen. I think there's also an element that we often carry on doing what we're used to doing. So we all understood levels. When we then changed it to something that maybe replicated levels in a different form, it's what we've always done, and therefore it's difficult to make that change. In terms of what's useful to the school then, Ofsted are really, really clear about this, is that from now on, schools should only be doing processes, whether it's how you assess the pupils in the classroom or how you're reporting on the data. They should only be doing those processes if it's useful to the school. It shouldn't be done for a third party. When I think back to 5-6 years ago, I'd often visit a school and they'd be doing a report for the governors, they'd be doing a report for Ofsted, and another one for maybe the school advisors, and then another one for the SLT and teachers. Now this is all about looking at what you do and only do it if it's useful. If it's not useful and there's no clear line to showing school improvement or impact on the pupils' learning, then Ofsted are very clear that it needs to be stopped doing it because it's not having the impact. And actually you have had reports from some schools that have been inspected, and the inspectors do ask, what are your assessment processes? They don't want to see the data, they want to know what processes you've got in place and what is the purpose of those processes. So they won't ask for the data, but they may ask for why you're doing it. The other thing is very key in all of this is the need to reduce workload. And we've all probably read the documents about that and how it's meant to be reducing workload across all of the stakeholders within the school. And this whole this autonomy and whether the data is useful for the schools fits in really well with that reducing workload. And I know of inspectors that have actually had discussions with members of staff, including office staff, about how has the school reduced workload, what auditing has taken place to work out what can be done where that's concerned. So I think this all links really, really nicely, and it gives schools a perfect opportunity actually to audit what you're currently doing and whether it's worth doing it. And is there a way of improving those changes? Or not? Maybe what you're doing is working really, really well for you. So if we just expand that a little bit, when I work with schools in terms of looking at tracking systems, either auditing what they've got or exploring new ways of doing things, I think about the key requirements. And I thought about this session and I thought, right, well, first thing is to have flexibility. And by flexibility, I mean, can whatever system you're using fit in with your methodology within your school of how you assess pupils and what that data means for you and what you need it to do? Or is it a case of picking a solution or a software package that kind of fits what you're doing, but you're having to work around it quite a lot? It needs to be flexible, a good system is my argument there. But I also think it needs to have flexibility in terms of change. So we know that the assessment landscape changes hugely, quite quickly, actually. And I think it needs to be capable of meeting those changing needs, not just sticking with one way of doing it. The next thing I think is that any system should have a fast data entry system because that can have a massive impact on the teacher's workload. So it needs to be efficient where that's concerned. And then finally, and arguably I think is probably where you can get the biggest gain in terms of workload, is whether a system that you are using has efficient reporting and analysis. I still meet head teachers that tell me that they spend days in the school holidays analysing and report writing. And I think those kind of, with the use of the technology we now have at our disposal, I think a good tracking system should be able to do that for you rather than you having to spend hours doing lots of that. It won't do everything necessarily, but it should save hours of time, which will enable leaders to concentrate on the what's next. What am I going to do as a result of the patterns I'm seeing within my data, rather than spending their time on number crunching and report writing. When I think about all of the requirements, that because it could be a really, really long list, the number one top tip I have, and I'm going to say this quite a few times in this, I think, is to keep it simple. So whatever the system you have or you want to have, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate things. So what I would recommend in terms of thinking about what you might want to do is looking at some key questions that you might want to ask yourself when you're trying to audit what you're currently doing and what you might want to do in the future. So the first one is to say, well, why am I recording this data? So look at your current system and say, what is the purpose of collecting that piece of information? And I'll come on more to that in a moment when we go into the software, and I'll just show you what sort of questions I would ask off the back of that. Is whatever I'm recording useful for driving school improvement? Because that is something that Ofsted may well ask. What is the purpose of doing it? I think in terms of auditing your current system, what needs to probably come into that is what system you are actually using. So have you bought a third-party package? Have you got your MIS? Could your MIS be doing it? So like Integris or whatever it is you're using. Could it be doing it instead of a third party? Is it most cost-effective what I'm doing? But also in terms of cost-effective, in terms of time, the processes that I'm currently doing, how much time are they taking? And can we somehow shave some of that time off by maybe either changing a system or maybe dropping something entirely if it's not proven impactful? And again, though, when you're asking those questions and you're beginning to think about what you might want, it's keep it simple. So with that in mind, with these questions in mind and the sort of the key requirements, I'm going to just jump into Integris and show you some examples of the sorts of things that you could be thinking about in terms of what you might want to do with your data. So let me just toggle to my Integris. Okay. So hopefully you can all see my Integris screen now. So what I often find with schools that are wanting to audit what they're currently doing or maybe thinking about a shift is that they often don't know what your MIS system is capable of doing. And I think that's actually really quite important, because what often happens is you buy something like ARM Integris and then 5-10 years down the line, it's moved on, but you haven't necessarily known how it's moved on and what the updates are, despite all best efforts and so on. So I think if you are thinking about what systems you're using and maybe you have a third-party assessment package, you may want to start by contacting your MIS provider and saying, okay, can you tell me what your system does for assessment? Because it could do things that you weren't aware of. And actually the amount you invest in your MIS is a huge sum of money, but you also spend often quite a lot of money on a third-party package. So if you can get the MIS to do the work for you, then it's a win-win. So let's go on into my assessment area within Integris. Okay, so within Integris, what I've done is I've set up some examples so that we can sort of talk through the various options that you might like to think about in terms of what you're doing with your data. Now, as Martin said earlier, he said that there are two main types of assessment. There's the formative, which often people think of in terms of having a key set of objectives that you tick against. And there's the summative, so such as in maths, is this child on track? So that's the two key differences. And I would say that when the new curriculum came about, a formative assessment was absolutely key. What we discovered was that a lot of people went out and bought assessment packages which had all the objectives from the national curriculum or from whatever system you wanted to use. And you could tick against all the objectives as often as you wanted through the year, and then it would formulate a summative grade for you and so on. And I think why a lot of people went down that route was because they didn't know the new curriculum, and it was a fabulous way of enabling schools to learn what the content of the curriculum was. I would then say in the last maybe couple of years, I've begun to see a move away from schools ticking against objectives, certainly on a computer, because they felt that it wasn't worth the time for teachers to put into it. Since COVID has come along, I'm getting more requests for being able to record formative data within the systems because people are wanting to see very specifically where the gaps are. So I think what I'd be saying on a formative basis is you really need to ask the question, do I need to be recording it on a computer? What I often find is that teachers will have their planning on their desk, and I know this is what I used to do back in the day when I was teaching, and they would just annotate it about kids who needed a bit more support or whatever. So the question to ask is, do I need that to be on a computer? Who else needs that data? Do the SLT need an overview or subject lead? If the answer is no, and the paper way or the way that the teachers are doing it is working for them, then perhaps stick with it. If the answer is yes, then it's about looking at how you might want that formative to appear in your system. So I'm going to come into an example here. So within this example, it's something that I've just set up. So this is a formative maths and it's got the national curriculum objectives on here. And the way Integris works is that the objectives have an abbreviation, and then you can point at the column heading and it pops up and gives you a full description there. So these are all the descriptions for place value for year 4 from the national curriculum. Now, I would argue that a good tracking system should offer you an out-of-the-box solution such as this one, or enable you to put your own objectives in. So one of the first questions I would get a school to think about is, what objectives do you actually need? Do you need all of the objectives, or would you be looking at key objectives that are important to your curriculum or your way of doing things within the school? If it's just the key objectives, then that would actually reduce the workload for the teachers as well, because what you're saying is the SLT or the subject leads need an overview just of the key requirements in each of the subjects. We don't need to see all of the objectives. If you want to do the all objectives, you can do that yourselves, but we just need that. So there needs that flexibility. The other thing you need flexibility in is how you're going to grade against those objectives. So the example on screen that you can see here uses a 1, 2, 3 or 4 approach, and schools that I've worked with use this as okay, it's been shown to them, but there's no evidence of independent learning. 2, they're beginning to get there. 3, they've got it. And 4, the greater depth. Now, it could be that that's all just too much. You could just have a yes-no approach. And actually, Integris does allow that degree of flexibility. Not all systems do. So it's thinking about, what do I need? What I'm finding, certainly with the advent of the new EYFS, the focus is now shifting to the kids that are working behind. So what you could do, for example, is not assess against all the pupils, but just assess for those that are working behind. Because actually they're the ones that you need to really be focusing in on. If everybody else is on track, then they're on track. So do you need your teachers to be actually putting that into the computer? These are questions that can only be answered by individual schools, not by me. I don't have the answer, unfortunately. I mentioned earlier about fast data entry. I believe there needs to be a choice of how your data is entered, because different schools will require different ways. And in fact, different teachers will want to enter their data in different ways. So within here, you could just simply put in the grade that you want the pupil to have and just go down the page. Or in fact, you could go across the page. Or I would argue for objectives, you've probably taught a unit of work. So why not flood fill a column and just say everybody got it, and then just amend those that didn't really quickly. So again, you're saving time for the teachers. So in terms of formative, it's about thinking, do I need to do it in the first place? And if I do need to do it, what is the bare minimum that I need? Okay. Now, the other thing that I think that a system should be capable of doing is enable you to show key trends really, really quickly from a markbook view, so without having to go into reporting and so on. And if I just scroll down at the bottom here, you can see it's given me averages for my columns, so I can very quickly see the areas that I need to maybe do a little bit more work on. I think you also need the ability, potentially think about what sort of calculations you might want to see on here. So if I open up another unit here, I can see I've got the percentage calculation of how many have been achieved. I've got an average on here. And I also have the ability to enter a summative data, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. The other thing that I think is really important is to be able to store comments against pupils, because there may be a good reason why data is as it is. So there's a little red flag against this pupil here. If I just click on that result, somebody has entered a note ill for 3 weeks, or it could be next steps are to, or just missing one key criteria there. So that enables anybody else looking at this data to know that there's something important on there. So that's what I would ask about the formative side of things. Do I need to be doing it, and how much detail do I need within there? So I'm going to come out of there now, and we're going to move on to the summative. And by summative, I mean summative teacher assessment wise, but also test wise. So think about, what do I need to be recording? And often when I'm devising systems with schools, they ask for loads and loads and loads, because they think they need reading ages, spelling ages, foundation subjects, teacher assessments, tests, scaled scores. They need loads and loads and loads. And then when we get into the nitty gritty, we end up pulling back a little bit. We think, right, come on, we need to keep this simple, because we need to give them the minimum amount of data that is required for what you need it to do. So let's go in and just look at some of the choices that you might be thinking about. So I've just set up an example here. Integris is really flexible. You can set it up how you like. So I just thought I'd set up just a few ideas just to talk you through here. So I think the starting point when you're talking about summative teacher assessment data is to think about what grading structure do I want to record against? So we know that we moved away from the levels 3C, 3B, 3A, and we then know that a lot of schools then went into year 3 emerging, year 3 developing, year 3 expected. So it's thinking about, what do you want to record? What do you need to be able to record? And I've got various systems here to kind of just show you the sorts of things you could be thinking about doing. So if you wanted a linear approach that was very one step per term, that's very old style national curriculum, but a lot of schools still hold on to it. You could have a grade structure that is similar to this. So this is actually an example that is a similar grade structure to Target Tracker. So we have quite a few schools that currently use something like Target Tracker and then want to mirror that within Integris and use the power of the MIS that you've already got. And this is an example of what that could look like. So if I just come down to year 4, for example, I've got 4B, which stands for beginning, 4B plus, 4W, so working within, W plus, and then the S and S plus, which is the secure. I've talked about flexibility. I think a system that uses the tracks assessment data needs to be flexible. So if you don't like these codes, you should be able to create what codes you need or ask us to do it for you, either way. So this is just an example of how you could go with a one step per term approach. I think the curriculum has moved away from that approach, but I do understand that some people still want that ability to see that kids are moving throughout the year. So that's in there. It does give you the benefit of being able to assess them out of year group in that system. The other sorts of system you could go to is a very similar system, but it uses a slightly different approach. It's not necessarily one step per term, but in this example, we've used a numbering system, but it could equally have been words if you wanted it to be. And the way it works is the number is before the year group. So I've got year 4 and I've got year 4-1. So that stands for emerging, developing, 0.3 is expected, and 0.4 is greater depth. And it doesn't use a one step per term approach, quite deliberately actually, because that's not necessarily how pupils learn through the year. But what this does allow you to do is to be able to assess pupils below the year group. So what some schools use this as that by Christmas they're emerging, and then by Easter they're developing, and then they've got it. Or for the majority of pupils, they are 4.3 expected all through the year. Some might be greater depth. And then for the pupils that are working below, you can then use the lower descriptors to actually assess how far behind they are. That's a very popular system because it enables you to quickly enter your data for the vast majority of pupils because they're all expected, and then refine it for those that are behind so that you can see how far behind they are and whether they are catching up. So you've kind of got the best of both worlds in a system like that. As I say, it doesn't have to be numbers, it could be letters. The final system, and we do have more and more schools that are moving over to this sort of system, and it's more akin to the new EYFS approach in many ways, is actually really, really simplifying things. If we think about what we need to know as teachers and SLT or governors looking at the system or trust directors, it's about what are we doing about the pupils that are not on track? It's about those kids that we need to support more. And that's what this new curriculum is about. It's about helping the pupils fill their gaps. So the idea behind this system is that anybody that's on track, based on what they've been taught, would be expected all through the year. If you've got any high flyers that are mastering the content, then you could actually mark them down as greater depth all through the year. For anybody that's not on track, you've then got a working towards category and a below category. So the idea behind this is that you would flood fill your column with the expected, add the greater depths in, and then you would concentrate on these pupils. That's where the conversations would come in, because what Ofsted do when they land, they don't look at your data. They will look in the pupils' books, they'll look for the evidence, they'll talk to the teachers and subject coordinators and so on, to be talking about the progress of those pupils. So arguably, do you need a tracking system that has all these refined grades going all over the place, or do you just need that system that marks who's behind and who isn't, so that you can then talk to the teachers in the pupil progress meetings to work out where those gaps are? And this is becoming more of a popular way of doing things now, and it saves a huge amount of teacher time. That's just 3 examples. I see on a weekly basis, I see all sorts of different codes in use and so on. And I think what's key is that it fits in with your methodology and your understanding of how things work in your school and your curriculum. There's no right or wrong approach on this. And I think that's what sometimes some people report back to me, they feel a little bit bullied to go with a certain system because other schools say it works great. Think about what works for your school. So If we then just, the next step to that, once you've kind of had to think about what sort of grading structure you might want, and again, try and keep it simple. I'm going to keep coming back to that because I think it's really, really key. You then need to think about what data do you actually need to collect. So I've got an example of a maths mark book here. I could have easily have shown you an example that had reading, writing, maths on one mark book, but I just thought it was easy to just stick to one subject at a time. So the other decisions you might want to make is what other information do I need to record? It's a given maybe that you're doing a teacher assessment, although some schools don't, they just do a test. Although I would say there's been a bit of a movement away from relying so heavily on the tests in the last couple of years, and people are beginning to move back to teacher assessments. They use the test results to inform the teacher assessment outcomes, I find. So this is an example of a Year 4 maths mark book. And I've chosen to put some contextual information about the pupils, because what I think is really important for teachers is when you're entering the data that you're aware of who's in what group. We know that the pupils change groups all the time, so they may well know a lot of the information about which groups the pupils appear in, but they may not know, for example, if a child becomes pupil premium, or that their attendance has dropped massively, although I suspect as a class teacher they probably are aware of that one. So any good system should enable you to choose what groups you have on the start of your mark book. And in this instance, I've chosen to put them on as standard on all these types of mark books, but actually you should be able to do it on the fly as well. You can choose different groups that you want to add onto your mark book by the individual user, because the SEN coordinator might want something different to the Year 2 teacher, for example. So those columns are on there. I also wanted to think about what prior information do I need to know about the pupils. So some systems that I have been familiar with, you can have some information on there, such as the prior data, but not necessarily all of it. And some people get frustrated that they have to, each time they go into a resource, they have to select which prior information they need, rather than always being there. So in this instance, I've chosen to always be able to see the early years data. And that's just expanding that unit. So it means I don't have to look at it the whole time, but when I want to refer to it, it's there. Same with the Key Stage 1 statutory data, that's on there automatically as well. You don't have to have these, but that's what I've chosen to do. And in this instance, I've chosen to see their prior data as well, so previous year's information. The other information I've decided to have on here is a target, so an end of year target that the teacher puts in. That could be generated from a prior outcome if you wanted it to, but in this instance, I've chosen it for it just to be a data entry column. And then the next decision I took is how many terms do I want to assess? And I've gone with autumn, spring and summer. Now, the Ofsted framework's quite clear that 2 to 3 times a year should be sufficient. So really think about how often do you need to be recording that data. Teachers will be doing ongoing formative assessment all the time because that's what they do in their daily job. But in terms of a data capture point, what do you really, really need in order to be able to assess the individuals and then the group data and the whole school data? I know of several schools that are just doing writing once a year, for example. I know of many other schools that are just doing a sort of January style assessment and then end of year assessment. Whilst I would say the majority of schools I still work with still want an autumn, spring and summer. It's got to fit in with what you want to do. So that's a decision to be made there. The other decision to be made is progress and how you're going to measure progress. And I would say that this is the most frequent question I get asked is, okay, we're really keen to streamline and go to a grading structure that's really simple. But how do we measure progress if there's not a movement through the year? So if they're not going from emerging to developing, for example, how do we know that the pupils are moving? Well, what I would argue on this one is that progress is about progress over time. So if a child was expected at Key Stage 1, are they still expected now? So do I need to see a number of steps to be able to measure that? Or do I just need a visual that tells me that pupil is maintaining their progress as would be expected across that key stage or across the year, depends on how many steps of progress you wanted. So whilst the other couple of grade systems I showed you do have they do return a sort of steps of progress, either a step per term or a step across the year. This one actually is even more simple than that. What it does is shows you whether they have maintained their grade since the end of the previous year and end of previous key stage. And that's what this is. So this column is end of previous year, and this one is end of previous key stage. So if I open up the Key Stage 1 data, I can see that this pupil was expected at Key Stage 1 and they're now working towards. So actually they've gone backwards. So I'm not having to think about, well, how many steps do they need to make? All I'm thinking is, have they maintained, or have they gained, or have they gone backwards? And for a teacher, any good system, you should be able to just very quickly come and sort on a column and say, show me those that have gone backwards. So those 2 kids have gone backwards. And I've got some down at the bottom here that have actually gained. So they've actually increased since the previous key stage or previous year, depending on what data you're looking at. So progress can be measured in a variety of ways. And so that's a discussion to have, or a thought process to have, as to how would you want to measure that. The other example I've got on here is a test column. Now this is just a very generic test column. I've just said summer test, and I've just entered it in terms of a numeric value. But you could have reading ages, and actually Integris is great because you can get it to work out the chronological age of the child, enter a reading age, and it will take one away from the other. So you know how many months ahead or behind they are. I remember working that out manually as a classroom teacher, and it used to take me hours because I had to work out how old the child was when they took the test, and then do a sort of cross grid to see what did they score on the test, and then oh dear gosh, yeah, it's bringing back horror stories. So if that data is useful to you and you need it recorded on a computer, then ask the question of the provider as to whether you can actually build in that sort of thing, or whether there's something available for you to do it. In this instance, though, I have just gone for a very straightforward numeric. It could be coloured, or it could be calculated from a raw score. The final thing that I decided I needed on here was a comment column. So I showed you this kind of little red flag comment, and that's about the specific result itself. Whereas this comment is about that whole pupil and their whole sort of experience in maths, if you like. So it's a more generic column. And the reason I wanted it on here is because I wanted to use it for parent reports. So what I wanted to be able to do is have teachers enter the data on here, also enter their comments for the student reports, and then get the MIS to produce the report for me for parents. So I was cutting out that need for teachers to have to rewrite what grade the pupil was by hand on a Word document or on a paper document or whatever, get them to type in their comments onto a Word document, and then collate it all and so on. I wanted to cut out that to save workload, and we have more and more schools that request the ability to do this now. So this just allows me, I haven't written very much, but it allows me to write a full comment in here, and then I can very quickly just move on to the next pupil and write a comment in there for them, with the eventual aim that you would end up with a report. Now, this is just a very quick example. You might end up with a report that looks similar to this. So you'd have the grades on there, you could have their attendance, and you could have comments come through onto it as well. Okay, and actually Integris has a parent portal, so that report could then automatically be made available to the parents through the parent portal, rather than having to email it or send it out. So it's about sort of joining the dots up, if you like, and sort of making the whole process of assessment a little bit more streamlined and to save time in the long run there. So again, coming back to what I was saying a moment ago, keep it simple. So I've shown you lots of different things that you could do here, but actually the question is, do I need to do it? What use is it going to be to me? And then if I do need to do it, how can I do it in as simple way as possible? So ask those questions of your provider if you're thinking of changing the system. So the final point to come on to now is looking at, okay, the data is all in now, what about the analysis? And I said earlier that actually I think this is where the biggest gain can be made in terms of teacher time and school leadership time. So Hello Data works with Integris, and it pulls the data from Integris to, again, so that you're not having to sort of enter any context data or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is flip into Hello Data and just show you the sorts of analysis that I think would be useful for a school. Because again, I think analysis can be complicated. I think you can produce so many data tables for the sake of it. So I was visiting school fairly recently, a few weeks ago, and we were looking at the data tables, and the governors had asked the head teacher to do breakdown by gender, ethnicity, SEN, pupil premium, there was one other category, term of birth, I think it was. And there were all these different data tables for each year group and so on, and it took the school a really long time to get that data out. So I then said to them, well, what's that telling you? What are those data tables telling you? And they said, well, nothing. There really isn't any differences between those groups. So my comment back was, so is there any benefit in including those analyses in your report to the governors? If it's not actually showing you anything, do you actually need to include it? Now, it certainly wasn't the head teacher's fault. It was something the governors were asking to. So I think it's a whole school culture change that needs to happen here. And I would argue, and certainly schools that have used this system for quite some time, what they're now doing is they're not producing data reports for governors. They're producing a data narrative. So they will get the reporting tool up on screen without the people's names. You can see people's names at the moment, and I'll talk about that again in a bit more. But what the report is about the what next. We've discovered that there's a difference between the boys and girls. If you want to see the actual data difference, by all means, here it is on the dashboard. But actually, this is what we're going to do about it, and this is how it fits into our school development plan. Therefore, cutting hours of time of producing these long data reports that, let's be honest, probably only get looked at by one governor. Possibly. I could be being a bit unfair. There are lots of, I used to be a governor, I used to love my data reports, probably too much. So I would think that any assessment system needs to have an analysis tool that is interactive and easy to use, which gives the reports that different stakeholders need. So this is an example here, and it uses Power BI technology. This is our whole school on track dashboard, and what it does is gives you a review of reception through to year 6 in this instance. So up here I can see the percentages that are on track for the good level of development at reception, and I've got my national data on this line here, this red line. I've then got a breakdown by reading, writing, maths and SPAG of the percentages that are on track for expected and above, and also the below. And I've got a percentage chart here that shows me the percentages that are on track for the combined figure. What I've also got here is an attendance for the school. I haven't got any nursery data. That's something I need to enter. And a whole school percentage figure as well there. So what I think a good tracking system needs to be is succinct in the data it's given you, which this is. It needs to be able to present the data in a different view. So some people are chart people. I'm not actually. I prefer a table of figures. So I'm just going to change the view at a click of a button. And what it's going to do now is just show me a table with the percentages instead of charts. Now, we have so many small schools, and what it also needs to be able to do is convert those figures into the number of children that fit those categories, because otherwise you can very easily be misled by percentages. The other thing you need to be able to have in any good analysis system is the ability to filter by groups. And there's two ways of doing it in this particular example that I'm showing you. So what I can very quickly do is say, well, okay, one group I want to look at, because I'm the SEN coordinator, for example, is I want to just see all the below children in the school. So I'm going to, and I'm interested in writing at the moment, so I'm going to click on the key down here that says below. And what it's going to do is now filter my pupil list here so that I'm just left with the children that are working below in writing. And I can hear my computer chugging away now. There we go. So now I've got a list of all the pupils that are working below, along with their scores and also what key groups they belong to in here. And a powerful system should enable you to sort on that data or sort of rank it so that it's nice and easy for you to analyse it. So there I've got year ones grouped together and so on. So that's one way of seeing your group data. Another way would be to actually just click on a figure in the chart. So I might be quite concerned by this 43% in this top chart. So I click on the 43%. What that will do is then filter the list to just show me the pupils that are not on track for the combined reading, writing, maths. Incidentally, I can also here search for an individual pupil if I wanted to just see one pupil's profile there. Okay, so there we go. So now it's just filtered by that. So that's a couple of ways of searching by groups. The other way would be to actually filter the entire dashboard by a certain group. So at a click of a button, I can click on my filter button up at the top here. I should just point out at this point, my husband has just joined a Teams call. I don't know whether you've all discovered since lockdown, but Teams tends to soak up the broadband width. So I apologise if things have just gone a little bit slowly here. Okay, so what we've got here is the ability to filter the dashboard by key groups. We've got gender, SEN, pupil premium, we've got ethnicity. We've also released today, actually, the ability to filter by custom groups. Now, this is the advantage of using your MIS for entering your data. It's pulling these custom groups from Integris. So I've got a COVID catch-up group one here. And what that will do, if I click on that, is it will then filter this dashboard to just show me the pupils that are in that COVID catch-up group so that I can actually see just their data. I may not have a huge number of pupils there. Wow, that group's doing incredibly well. I'd be very pleased with that intervention group. You can see that we've got 100% on track. Just very made up data, you may have guessed. So I can do multiple filters in there if I want to. The other thing you might want to do is actually have a group comparison. So you can see groups alongside each other. And again, a good reporting tool will enable you to do this. And I can either go and choose a new dashboard along the bottom here, or I can use my quick links. So I'm just going to quick links to my on-track dashboard here. So what this is going to do here is break down for 1 year group, although I could select more than 1 year group. I could select the whole school, for example. So for year 6, what it's doing now is showing me the percentage of children that are on track by key group. So I've got my boy-girl comparison there for reading, writing, maths and combined. There's my pupil premium down here. Okay, so I've got that breakdown really, really quickly without having to apply lots of different filters and do lots of different screens and so on. It's all in the one place. Because some people like charts, on this particular example, we've also got a chart, and the dark blue line shows you the latest national data. So you can compare your data against the latest national benchmark data available. For teachers, this is a particularly good dashboard, as well as for other people, actually, because I have a sheet here that with their children's names that enables me to see which subjects they're on track on and which they're not. And actually, you can apply a filter to say, just show me those that aren't. It's a great starting point for pupil progress meetings. This particular dashboard is also good for governors. The governor version of this doesn't show any people's names. So they're seeing exactly what you see, but without getting down to the individual pupil name. Again, any good reporting tool should be interactive. So if I click on All Pupil Premium, it will then change my graphs to show me the All Pupil Premium, and I've now filtered just to Pupil Premium. Something that I also think any reporting system needs to give you is the ability to look at your data over time. So the last example I'm going to show you here is to go to the Cohort Analysis. So on here, what it's doing is I've got year 6 selected onto here, and it's showing me their journey through the school. So I can see what percentage were on track for expected and greater depth, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the current year 6 data here. So it means I can see a trend, and as a governor, this is really, really useful. So I can very quickly see what the trend, so it dipped from when they first joined, and then we had a steady increase. Actually, an example I showed the other day, it showed clearly where COVID was. It was probably must have been with a different year group because there was a big dip, and hopefully it's going to begin to pick back up again. And again, these reports are all the ability to filter, to sort of drill down into what you're interested in looking at. So if I click on my change view button, I see it's percentage of tables. I can click again and I should get the count, I think is the next one. And if I click again, it will show me the pupils' names. So I've got the pupils' names down here, but it's a bit busy, this one. Some people love it, but it's got all of the subjects and all of the years on there. So there's quite a lot of information. Whereas if I click once more, this table is fabulous. So there's somebody I was chatting to the other day that he hadn't realised that we'd updated this and provided this. And he said it saved him hours this time round on his data collection. So in his pupil progress meetings, he could then say, well, Alison has been expected all the way along. And in fact, you can search by one pupil on here, and you can also filter by your groups as well. So I would say that your reporting needs to be interactive, it needs to be quick, it needs to be using the data from your MIS system, so you're not having to duplicate information. It also needs to be configurable, so that if you're using a different grade than what you can see on screen, it can accommodate that. It needs to be able to do your progress and your attainment. Okay, the very quick time. Martin, have I got time to quickly show the multi-school?
You've got a couple of minutes.
A couple of minutes, that's all I need, thank you. Martin will tell you that I am very passionate about the assessment world, and I can just talk all day if you give me the chance. So let me just very quickly, I talked about earlier about how they've got different stakeholders. So we do have advisors that support many schools, and they can access through that dashboard several schools at once. So they can just flip between the schools. But we also have trusts that use this, that want to collate the data and compare the data alongside each other so that they can see their schools alongside each other. And so we've got the multi-school. And again, this is pulling from all the MISs. That's the beauty of this. So the core data is held within the MIS, as is the assessment data. And then this is just using the Power BI technology to number crunch it for you. So just very quickly, as I say, it has gone go slow because my husband is chattering away next door as well. He's not in the field of assessment, he's in technology. So what it's going to do is give me a view to be able to compare my schools alongside each other. So we'll just let them come through there. Okay, so it's just catching up on your screen now. I think there's a delay as well, actually, between my screen and it appearing. Okay, so here we go. So the first dashboard it lands on, in this case, is a summary dashboard. And what it enables you to do is to compare the pupils groups across the schools. So I can see how many boys I've got in each of my schools. So my schools are going across the top, and then I've got my key groups down the left-hand side. And then it does it in chart format for me as well. Incidentally, there is one of these in the individual school dashboard as well. I just didn't get a chance to show you that. So this very quickly just shows you your numbers, and you can toggle it to percentages if you prefer. But you can also see your assessment data, and I won't spend long because the dashboard works in exactly the same way as what I've already shown you. But this is the power of it. So again, I've got my schools running along the bottom, and I can see what percentages are on track for expected and greater depth by school. In this instance, you can choose maybe 2 out of your 5 schools, and it will then give you the figure for those 2 that you've selected. Or if you've got all of them selected, it will then give you the figure for all the schools you've got selected. So you've got an academy-wide figure there. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with the detail of that. You can throw national data, you can get it to show as a table, and all as you could before. But I'm very conscious of time, so thank you for bearing with me. What I'm going to do is just flip back to our PowerPoint and just quickly wrap my session up on that one. Okay, so what I wanted to do was actually just finish by going back to the key questions again, actually, and just remind ourselves of the key things. So what I would say is you need to audit your current system potentially if you think there's room for change. So how are you going to assess pupils? What are you going to assess? And who's going to be involved in that process? And how much time does that take? Is the information that I want to collect going to be meaningful? Or maybe that I'm collecting now, is it meaningful information? If not, stop doing it. What changes can I tweak or make, or substantial changes even, to improve or reduce the workload, but improve those pupil outcomes? I think those 2 things are key. And then my final thing, and I said I would keep telling you this, keep it simple. Whatever you do, don't overcomplicate it. And I'm going to stop at that point and hand back over to Martin.
Thank you, Kim. Excellent. So in this session, we've looked at sort of how data can be stored and structured in RM Integris, and how that data can be analysed and presented, and how you might use that data within the role that you have. We sort of started the session, and Kim's mentioned several times through, about sort of the fundamental principle: is it worth it? Does the data you collect bring a benefit to the pupils and teachers to help them maximise the pupils' learning? And I think that's really the key question in any data exercise that you do. It's kind of got to be worth it. So whichever systems you're using, the question is that cost-benefit analysis. Dylan William, for those of you who sort of know him from the formative assessment area, once said, how do you stop teachers doing valuable things and start doing even more valuable things? And I think, that question he used, teachers, there could be applied across any sort of area. And it's really around sort of evaluating what you do, stopping some things and starting some other things, not trying to take on sort of too many extra things, which will effectively just not function well in the longer term. Looking to the future, we at RM Integris are challenging ourselves to provide the tools to help teachers be more effective and efficient, both from the sort of the teacher level right through to the sort of the LA and the trust level. We're aware that schools use multiple systems to collect the data, and we want to sort of look and see how we can provide simpler systems and more effective systems. Many trusts, we notice, are employing data specialists, and it's a key area for growth in the education industry, especially in the representation of data and making sure that that data is meaningful for the person that's viewing the data. So that's the end of our session. So we hope you found it useful and thought-provoking, and I'm now going to hand back to Mel.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Kim. That was really interesting, and particularly if, like me, you love seeing that sort of data visualization, as well as the tables, being able to, look at the data in different ways. It's the kind of tools that I love to use in my job. So, as I said earlier, if anybody's got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A now. We've got a couple there already, so I shall put them to you guys. So one is, if a school is switching from another assessment tracking system to using RM Integris for entering this data, can the historical data be transferred across?
So I'm going to let Kim answer that one.
Yes, 9 times out of 10, absolutely it can. So providing that you can get it, so the one time that it can't is if you can't extract it out of the current system you're using, we can't then bring it in. But I've yet to come across a system where we can't get the data out in some form. I've gone and said that now, haven't I? So I'm happy to be challenged on that one. Yes.
Okay. And another question is, how quickly could a school get up and running with using the assessment module of RM Integris?
Okay, yeah, really good question. So it would depend on which route you decide to go down. So if you wanted to use one of Integris's off-the-shelf products, so the mark that's already ready for you to start using straight away, you could get using that within a day. If you wanted to design your own structure, that would take a little bit longer, and you would work with RM to work out what your requirements were. You could either learn to do it yourself, or it could be done for you, whichever route you want. So that would just take maybe a week to get that up and run, a week or two, just to get you going across for that.
Okay. And what are RM's plans around data collection and presentation in RM Integris?
So I think I can answer that one. So there's probably twofold really in RM Integris. So there's an area around the presentation of data, and that really sort of falls into a couple of categories. One is around sort of very much looking at, for those schools that are in trust, how do you grab that data from different schools and put them together and then represent them so it's meaningful at sort of the trust or the governor organization. So we're doing some work on sort of trust analytics. So some of the things that Kim's shown you there from Hello Data, the sort of other things that we're doing within RM Integris. And I think the second thing is, how do you make sure that you get the data to the user in the quickest fashion? So one of the things we are looking at is we're looking at sort of, when you first log on to something like Integris, you have a sort of set of graphs and charts that are ready for you to sort of see and are meaningful to you. So it's two things really. One is looking at the role of the person, so making charts and graphs available that are appropriate for the role. And the second thing then is around customization. So me as a teacher, if I log on, I probably want to know about my class, and I might want to, I may also have a teaching and learning responsibility in the school. So I may be interested in, say, how the maths area is going. So making that sort of flexible, if you like, so I can pull the charts and graphs that I use sort of very regularly onto my screen. So when I log on, it's there front and center, and I can see it, be efficient and take action.
Okay. Does the data pull through automatically into reports?
Yeah, so the data that I showed, within Integris, they have something called data share. So that means that Hello Data connects automatically. So every night it automatically grabs your data, but you can also at any point during the day click on a button and it will go and grab any updates that you've made to the data. So yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting, and sort of around the whole sort of data aspect is, how often do you update the data? So we're actually sort of looking at the data that we get and how often it is right to update it. So it's a very interesting question. So you can imagine sort of Kim's talked about assessment data, which probably doesn't change, sort of that often. Whereas something like attendance, for instance, if you wanted to say compare those children who have had poor attendance with what they do in the classroom and their assessments, the attendance data, particularly sort of keeping on top of it, making sure children in school, that needs updating a lot more frequently. So it's the data that's stored and the data that's represented, working out which needs to be updated sort of maybe overnight, as Kim said, and that which maybe needs to be updated a bit more often is one of the things that we're looking at.
Okay, thanks. So that's all the questions we've got at the moment that have come through. If anybody thinks of any other questions they want to pose afterwards, there is a Knowledge Hub section on the website. So on the conference website, if you're logged in, you should easily be able to find the Knowledge Hub. And if you go to the Let's Talk School Management virtual exhibition booth, then there'll be RM colleagues on hand over the next few days to answer any other questions that you've got. So do get in touch if you've got anything else that you'd like to ask. There'll also be an attendee pack that will be sent to everybody who's registered for this session, and that will come through by email in the next 24 to 48 hours. So please keep an eye on your inbox for that. That will include the link to the recording of this session, your certificate of attendance, and a short survey. And just a plea that we'd really, really appreciate any feedback that you can all give us on the survey, so that it can help feed into future sessions and future events like this that we run. But other than that, unless anybody's got anything else they want to add, then thanks everybody for attending, and we hope to see you in the next session, which is at 12:15, and that's on Leaving No Learner Behind, Empowering Potential with Microsoft, with Aaron Smith, who's a SEND consultant at Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.